Hello to all of you and welcome to the Common Sense Gospel. I'm Danny Simmons.
And I'm Kurt Norbert.
Today our topic is sacrifices. And this is going to be the sacrifices that we can offer. Kurt and I realized coming off of Jesus' crucifixion and spending that time in that series and looking at the steps that were taken and the timeline in which those things took place, that we were witnessing together the greatest sacrifice that has ever been offered, ever. That ever has been offered and ever will be offered. Our perfect example has been set, and as his disciples, we are obliged to sacrifice our life in our service to him. And so when you think about sacrifice and the fact that Christ sacrificed himself to God for us, that we might be redeemed and reconciled, we're brought into fellowship with God through that sacrifice which Jesus offered, that there's a commitment from us that understanding that and wanting to be like his son, we recognize that sacrifice is going to be a crucial part of our Christian lives, the rest of our lives. So we'll start in Romans 12 and look at a passage together that really, this is probably one of the better passages about sacrifice because of how completely it explains what we should be doing with our lives as Christians. Romans 12 and verse 1. Paul says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, I beg you, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice. And he points out that is holy, it is acceptable to God, and it's our reasonable service. I think some translations say it's our reasonable worship to offer ourselves, our lives, as a living sacrifice. So that's everything, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is such a great passage because as you were pointing some of these great truths out that Paul brings for us here, I was kind of focusing on that phrase, a living sacrifice, and thinking back to the Old Testament system where those sacrifices were dead. They killed the animals because blood had to be shed for the forgiveness of sin. But here, as priests to God, we're giving a greater sacrifice. It's a living sacrifice. And Jesus talked about, for anyone who would follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So there's that sense of a living sacrifice. It's an ongoing thing. As long as our lives last here on this earth, we are to be a sacrifice to him. We are to be giving that sacrifice every day.
And it is an absolute commitment, is a determination. You have to say, I am resolved. Those kind of phrases are really good. I am going to sacrifice my life. And that is all inclusive. It's your time, the air that you breathe, the thoughts that you think, where your money and your effort goes to, that all of those things can be sacrificial in their nature, that they're given to us, we're entrusted with them, we're stewards, and so we use them to the glory of God. And in chapter 12, as he says, now make yourself a living sacrifice. By the mercies of God, you can perform this great work. If you move down to verse 9 of that chapter, he almost gives like these bullet points of different ways to do that may or may not naturally come to our mind. So verse 9, let love be without hypocrisy. That would be a sacrifice to remove all hypocrisy, to fix what's wrong in my life so that I can love in a pure and godly way. And know in my heart that it's pure and it's godly, because I'm not a hypocrite. I'm doing the best that I can to serve and to honor God. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor, giving preference to one another. I don't know how you feel about that, but that takes some sacrifice.
Yeah, well, in that sense, in every instance of that, you're giving yourself up. You're dying to self again because you're putting that other person before you. You're more concerned about their well-being than your own, and it's so easy for us to, if a situation comes up, we want to be justified.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be vindicated, whatever it might be. But that is a sacrifice. You're giving up what you want for the good of someone else. That's exactly what Jesus did. He gave himself up for our good.
It's a reciprocating love. It's a reciprocating effort to give preference to one another. It's me giving preference to you and trying not to hope that you'll give preference to me, and you're doing the same thing. You're saying, I'm determined to be a sacrifice, so I give preference to you. You're first, and then I've come with the same attitude. These are the children of God who have determined together, because of the will of God, to give preference to one another and to love one another. And so I always feel like I have to point out to people that we're a family, just like an earthly family. There's some people that you're close to that you just love, and that's just the way it is. You give them a lot more room to say things that could be rude or hurtful because you love them, and they know that you know that they love you, and you're inherently able to give them more room to say things that other people wouldn't be allowed to in your own mind. And by the same token, there's going to be people in that family, and as we're looking at it here, in that church, that local church, that are more difficult. It's more difficult to break through and to have a good conversation and to figure out where in the world they are. Like what do they need? It's just the way it is. And I think in that is the beauty of God's design, that if I step into this saying, I'm going to sacrifice myself, then I can take the time required to dig a little deeper, to help, to assist, to genuinely show care and concern for someone that naturally I wouldn't even sit next to on the bus, But God's put us in together, and He says we're living stones. So now that settles all of my issues. It has to, or I'm not being a living sacrifice. So the challenge is never going to stop being there in front of us.
Yeah, and in that analogy, if it's always going to be me first, that is just not going to work.
It's the opposite of sacrifice, isn't it?
And really, if all of the members of that family are giving preference to each other, that lifts everybody up. It's like the old saying, the rising tide lifts all the boats. Well, if you're going to be that rising tide and everyone else has that same sacrificial concept, everyone is giving each other preference. So we're always humbling ourselves and lifting each other up in that.
Yeah. And God, how pleased is He when He sees it working as it should by His design. And He just continues, brotherly love. He says, not lagging in diligent, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. There's sacrifice. We can see that one. Serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation. That's sacrifice. Continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints. That's sacrifice. We see that one. Mm-hmm. Given to hospitality. Definitely a sacrifice. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. So it's interesting that Romans 12, 1 and 2 tells us what we need to know. And then a list given by God is laid out to, if you're having trouble with some of this, here's what it looks like in the life of someone who's serving God.
And all of those, of course, as you mentioned, they illustrate His point in verses 1 and 2, but they're all putting yourself second or third. It's always doing for someone else, and that's the sacrificial attitude. That is what Jesus did. He was always doing for something else. He came to serve and not be served.
Yeah.
So He didn't look for that. He just took those opportunities to do according to the, of course, godly ability that He had, to lift people up, to direct them in the right way, to rebuke sin, to do the Father's will throughout His life so that He could be that sacrifice that we needed. And then the example that we have to follow. But we might look at the question, where does all this start? When do I become that sacrifice? And I think Paul deals with that earlier in Romans, over in chapter 6, beginning at verse 1 then. He says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it?" So he introduces this idea, dying to sin. "Do you know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore, we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." So Paul very clearly points out that it is when we are immersed for the forgiveness of sins that we die. That's where we die to self. Sin has been put to death in us. I'm not looking at me first anymore. That is dead and buried here, figuratively in the water. And then by the power of Jesus' resurrection, I am also then raised to walk in a new life. That's where that sacrifice is made. Okay, I'm going to kill myself. Myself is going to be gone out of this picture, and I'm going to rise to walk with Jesus and serve him. So, to me, that's a beautiful picture of that objective starting point. Here's where like you talked about, you make a commitment. Here's where I am deciding to get myself out of the picture, and it's going to be all about Jesus from now on.
And that idea of serving like behind the scenes without recognition and without expecting recognition is one of the greatest challenges I faced stepping into this newness of life. And like, as you said, putting to death self. Paul calls that the old man. It's the man of greed and lust and selfish desire that we esteem him crucified, and he can't reign in our hearts anymore. Romans 6 goes on to say that we were either slaves of sin or slaves of righteousness. It's one or the other. And so it's just making that conscious decision that I don't need anyone to say good job or to pat me on the back. And I'm telling you, that is so hard. The world's built on that I work hard to be recognized, to get a pay increase. Everything is set up that way. And I'm just using money as an example, but everything. Children get into terrible fights at a very young age trying to gain the attention of their parents and are jealous over each other because parents seem to pay more attention. It's everywhere. And so God says, that's not good for you. If you can set that aside and learn how to serve. And I know, Kurt, I've met a few people that I've seen do it, and I've seen them not desire any attention. And there's nothing more moving to know that they're out there, that they exist, and that they're just trying to honor God. And it also demands, at least of me, as I think and consider them, it demands that I understand that they believe in the reward to come.
And that's a good point to bring up, Danny, because when you look at Matthew 25, for example, and the judgment scene that Jesus gives there at the end of the chapter, what is it that he commends those who are at his right hand for? It's the little things. It's the behind-the-scene things that most people would not know about. Jesus commends them for visiting him when he was in prison or sick, or clothing him when he was naked, or feeding him when he was hungry, giving him to drink when he's thirsty. And naturally, the righteous say, "Lord, when did we ever do that for you? We weren't alive when you were here on the earth, so when could we have possibly done that?" And he says, "When you do it for one of these least of my brethren, you did it to me." Well, we look at those as the little things. You give someone some food to eat. You give them a jacket or whatever when they're cold. Big deal. That's what pleases the Lord. When you're giving up something for the benefit of something else without any thought of return, or as you were pointing out, recognition, that's what he commends. And it's not to belittle those who maybe are giving sacrifices, making sacrificial efforts that are a bit more visible. For example, when you preach every Sunday, you put a lot of time and work and effort and study into that. You're sacrificing time that you might want to use to go do something else because you are serving others. You're serving the Lord. You're serving the brethren here by imparting a message or a lesson from the Word. But there's so much. I mean, that's the tip of the iceberg, or the visible things like song leading or teaching a class.
Right.
I think the church really runs on the multitude of things that only the Lord sees and those who are involved, what we call the little things. But those are sacrifices that lay up treasure in heaven.
That's right.
The Lord recognizes those, and He's pleased with those sacrifices.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, as you said that, I'm thinking today's September 1st, as we record this today, this is the opening day for dove season. And I'm sitting here with you. I mean, I'm sacrificing.
Yeah. And, it's relative because it isn't to me. I mean, I didn't know it was the opening day of dove season until you just brought it out. Now, I'm not averse to hunting. I've gone out going after hogs and what have you. My son likes to hunt doves. I've never done that. I would. I think I would try it if I was given the opportunity, but it's not something I get excited about that I'm looking forward to September 1st. I've already got my tags or permits or whatever it is you need. Whereas you, that's something you're looking forward to. So for you, that is a sacrifice. You could be out there cleaning up your shotgun, whatever it takes to get ready for dove season.
Sure.
But we'd rather be here right now. So if you hadn't mentioned that, no one would know about that sacrifice. And someone might say, well, big deal. So what, dove season? Well, for you, it's a thing.
Yeah.
So God is the one that is that we're concerned about.
Right.
What does He see? He sees it. Well, yes, He gave up that time to do this in my service. That pleases Him.
Yeah.
Even though for someone else, they might not see it that way, but it's really God who matters.
Yeah. Yeah, I was joking, but you definitely turned that into a very valid point. And like you said, everybody has their different wants, needs, concerns, and desires. And so it is simply setting those things aside. And I think in that is something else I've learned about the Lord is that if let's say I lied to you and said, oh, I'm not feeling too good, so let's move the date. And so I'm out there in the woods, looking for flying birds. You know what would happen? Nothing. There would be no dove because God talks to me in all kinds of ways. And, and so it's part of that too. I'm halfway joking, but part of that is that they'll be there when I get there. You know what I mean? It's not that big of a deal. And most things aren't. So there's a lesson there too as well, that the things that we magnify, well, I got to give this up. It's like, it ain't that great. And 90% of the population would say that right off the bat, in most cases. You've made a big to-do over something that really is not that big of a deal at all. And it just stinks of selfishness. You can just smell the stench of someone who's that bought in to themselves, that everything is a back-breaking sacrifice. That's not true. It's a matter of trusting that Jesus says it is more blessed to give than to receive, and say, okay, He is God, He is right, and I'm going to try this. And I think, almost immediately, there's some other reward it's not tangible. It's not, you know what I'm saying? But there's something where you say, I gave everything I could today for the benefit of someone else. And that's just between me and maybe the person I helped and the Lord. And it's not going to go any further than that. And all of a sudden, this filling reward comes in that I'm finally living out who I'm supposed to be, and that's the treasure. Getting stuff is not the treasure, because we watch that play out too. People who get just demand more, and they're upset that they don't have more. And how could you be plagued while people are constantly giving to you? It's because you're not living out life as a sacrifice the way God intended. He's designed us this way. It's not a trick, It's purposeful for Him to say, get this figured out. and understand who I am. Because, we started in Romans 12. I think Paul starts there by saying, you therefore, and when Paul says therefore, he's just finished a powerful statement. So if you back up at the end of chapter 11, he says, God has shown mercy on us all. Oh, the depth and the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. And that's what we're talking about today. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has become his counselor? Are you gonna go counsel the Lord? I mean, how silly. Verse 35, or who is first given to him, and it shall be repaid to him. For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. And then he says, now I beseech you, give yourselves as a living sacrifice every day.
I like to remind myself along those lines that God is a giver. When you read through the scriptures, God is always doing something for someone else.
Yes.
He constantly gives, and he delights in that. In fact, a couple passages in the Old and New Testament, he challenges his people to put me to the test and see what I can do for you, to see how much I can bless you. He loves to show how much he can give to those who want to serve him.
That's right.
And to me, that's just so important to keep in mind, that God is a giving God, ultimately giving his Son the greatest gift. How can I do any less for him? And I'm really nothing to give to him. Who am I? I was a lost sinner until he could extend his grace and his forgiveness to me.
Yeah, that's right.
But he accepts me, he washes me, he brings me into his family, brings me into his service. That's the example that we need to follow. God constantly is giving, and therefore so do we, as much as our ability allows. That's
right. And the beautiful thing about us kind of working that out is that it was given to us. No matter what it is you're giving up, that was given to you by him. Mm-hmm. And those things are in the right and appropriate place, then it's so much easier to step into this. It will be a challenge for a number of reasons, but having confidence in that is so reassuring for us. And there's another passage that talks about sacrifice, because part of this process for us is just saying, okay, the Lord wants us to sacrifice. What is it? What is it that makes him happy or that pleases him? How do I work this out in my life? Give me something practical so that I can make sense of it in my day-to-day life. And so Hebrews 13 is another place that we could visit. Hebrews 13 and verse 15. Really, there's two verses here back to back that mention sacrifice. Verse 15 of Hebrews 13 says, therefore by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. So I love this one because it is praise, it is the fruit of our lips, and it is giving of thanks. That, to me, that is psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs that we sing either when we're by ourselves or that we sing to God. And James says in his epistle that if any of you are joyful, let him sing songs. So we sing out of joy, and we sing to the Lord, and we're thankful for all that he's done. And the Bible tells us that's a sacrifice.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
And there again, it shows you that relative importance of sacrifices in the sight of others that we were talking about with doves. We would think, I'm singing. Well, the Bible tells me it's so I can teach and encourage my brethren around me and be encouraged by them as they sing. And we enjoy it. I love music. I love singing, the great hymns that we have. But we don't think of that often as a sacrifice. But really, anything we're doing for the Lord is a sacrifice. As priests, we're offering these sacrifices to him. And although this passage focuses on the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name, and we generally focus on singing there. Praise and prayer is a sacrifice of praise to him. We're acknowledging him. We're seeking his will. We're giving him thanks. Every time we speak, we should be glorifying Jesus Christ, offering that sacrifice of praise. So, Paul touches on that. Let your speech be seasoned with salt, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Don't let profane speech come out of your mouth. Why? Because the fruit of our lips is a sacrifice. Am I saying something that's beneficial? Is it exalting the Lord? Is it helping someone else? Is it lifting my spirits as I pray, or as you pointed out, I'm singing a hymn because I just feel good. I want to sing to the Lord. A lot of times I'll pray, or I will play in my car, just psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. And it's great to hear those and sing along because it cheers you up.
Yeah, it sure does.
God's made us that way. Music's a powerful force in our lives. He designed it that way, and so he tells us to sing. He tells us to pray. That's also a powerful force. He tells us to speak words of comfort and grace to others. That's powerful.
That's right.
All of those are a sacrifice of the fruit of our lips.
That's right. Yeah, using your language to glorify God and to speak well of him, to be thankful to him for all things, is something you can share with others, and it's a sacrifice because the alternative would be to speak, as you said, corrupt things that come up out of my polluted heart. All that does is reveal the contamination within. It's not a sacrifice to God. I'm back in my selfish world, and it's not pleasing to God. But the sacrifice of praise to God is pleasing unto him. And in verse 16, again, the very next verse, but do not forget to do good and to share, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. And so now there's another couple of things given to us. Do good. That just became a giant list. What's good? Whatever God calls good, sacrificing ourselves is good. So do good and share. And it's almost like the Hebrew writer is talking to a bunch of 5-year-olds, Now remember, class, do good and share. How are we going to spend our day? Say it after me. We're going to do good and we're going to share. But even in that, in the simplest of terms, if we do good and we share today, that is a sacrifice that is well-pleasing to God.
Yeah, and when you said it's like talking to 5-year-olds, I said, yeah, it is, because we need that reminder.
Yeah.
It's so easy to slip back into self. We need to be reminded to do good, to share, that others are greater than ourselves, that their needs are more important than mine, because if I have faith, God's going to look after me, and he's entrusted me with certain resources and certain abilities that I can use for the benefit of someone else. So as that opportunity comes up, and I have that ability, like we talked about in a previous podcast, I have that responsibility. So as you look at all these different things that you've talked about and brought up, and we've looked at for sacrifices, really every day you're basically sacrificing all day long.
Yeah.
if you're walking in Christ, because your thoughts are always outside of yourself, and I'm speaking ideally here because we don't always not think of ourselves, and that's a double negative, I guess. But training ourselves to think outside of ourselves, that's a sacrifice, because I'm having to give effort to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to what was pointed out when we introduced this whole line of discussion with Romans 12. It's giving yourself as a living sacrifice. Everything we do, everything we say can be a sacrifice for God, even if we don't think of it that way. The Hebrew writer is telling us here, fruit of lips, doing good, sharing what you have. Those are sacrifices. So if we look at Jesus as a life of sacrifice, where he came to serve and not be served, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He was here to give, to serve, to do for others. Every day, all the time. That's our pattern.
That's right.
Now, I know I'm never going to live up completely to that, but that's the goal that's set.
That's right.
And when I fall short, I can ask for the Lord's forgiveness and seek his strength and his guidance and work with me to enable me to do that. But there's our pattern. As Jesus lived every day of his life in service, then so can we. That should be our viewpoint, and that should be the attitude we train ourselves to have.
He is the perfect example, and he'll always leave us wanting. But as you said, the goal and being focused on that and dedicated to it. God knows the heart. He knows the desire that we have and how we are truly trying to do these things. And when they're worked out, and they're worked out his way, and we can set ourselves to the side to do it the right way, then the Bible's plainly told us that God is well pleased. And this picture, I think honestly, you can open to any book in the New Testament and see this instruction given to Christians. Philippians 2 and verse 3, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. So put yourself aside. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. So I'm esteeming everyone around me, I'm esteeming them higher than myself. I have a lowliness of mind approach. It's not poor me. It's just I know my place, and I'm a servant. And then it's interesting because he says, let each of you look out not only for his own interest. So it's okay. You have interests. You can look out for them, but don't get locked in there to where you're not looking outward for the benefit of your brethren. So again, that is appropriate and proper sacrifice. I have tended to the things that concern me and my needs in this life, my family. And now I've done that. I've got to go outside of that and not dismiss myself as saying, well, I've done all I can do, because God says, no, that's not true at all. You have a lot to offer, and he knows it better than anyone because he's the one that gave it to us. So think about it this way. God's put an investment in you, and he wants a return on that investment.
Oh, that's right. Just like in the parable of the master that he was going away, so he gave talents to his servants. He expected a return, and he rebuked the final servant who said, well, I was afraid of you, so I just went and hid it in the ground, and I'm giving back to you what's yours. And he says, you're miserable and lazy servant.
That's right. God
wants a return on his investment. He expects it, and he deserves it. When you put money in the bank, what do you expect? A return. You're not just giving it to him with nothing in it for you. So if God has invested in us, he deserves that return. And we might ask, well, how do you get there? We've been talking about, here are things you can do. Here's what the Lord wants. Here's what sacrifice is. I think Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians 8 when he commends the brethren there. And I think you touched on it a little bit. Sometimes we have the attitude of, well, I've done everything I can, so that should settle it. Paul commends the Corinthian brethren here for going beyond what he expected that they could do. Here he's talking about in 2 Corinthians 8, verses 1 through 5, he was collecting from the churches an offering to bring to the poor saints in Judea. And he points out that the Corinthians, even in their poverty, begged him to let them be involved in that. And out of that poverty, they gave above their means. They went beyond the limits, so to speak. And he says, you gave yourself for the relief of the saints. And in verse 5, he says, and this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. That's really, I think, the foundation. If you give yourself to the Lord, then there's no limit to what you can do. you can, when you see the need, and we've seen it happen, people just go to the nth degree to try to be a help.
Yeah.
And that's what sacrifice is all about. It comes from a volitional choice, a decision of the heart that I've given myself up. I belong to the Lord. I'm here to serve him, and here's what I can do.
Yeah, that's an amazing picture. According to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing. And he said, as you said, he tells us why. They gave themselves to the Lord first, and then to us by the will of God. And when that's done that way, then you can give beyond your ability, and you can figure out how to do that. And I think that it's an amazing thing. I think sometimes it's that you feel like I've done all that I can today, and you take one more deep breath and you just see through the final step. Let's move this final piece of furniture. Let's sit a few more minutes with someone who's in the hospital, even though we've had a long day. That those things, when you kind of muster up the strength, that's beyond your ability. And and I think again, those moments when you go home and you say, "Man, today was one of those days. I served the Lord," and it's almost like when you pray that night, it's like, we did good today, God. We did good. And I hope that he's in agreement with that. Yeah, we did. You showed the world what I'm about many times over, and that's all my benefit. He's not a me God. Like you said, he's a constantly giving God, but he's watching someone work out the gifts that he's given to the purpose that they were given. And so in that is the beautiful spiritual walk of life that God wants each one of us to have and to enjoy.
I like what you mentioned earlier in our discussion today. We've all had that time when we feel really good because we helped someone in whatever it was. And that's okay. God has made us that way. That's part of the reward, I believe, that he gives, and that's one thing you touched on. We feel good when we know that we've done something for somebody, when we've given up for someone else. And I can't help but think that God feels that way too. He feels good in giving. And we know that. He tells us that he delights to give. And since we're created in his image, he wants us to have that good feeling too. And we only get it when we step out of ourselves and give for the benefit of someone else.
Yeah, that's the only place to find it. And many of you who are listening today, you know that. You've sensed that in your own life. And it's a good exercise to go through these topics, the spiritual instruction that God's given. And obviously we mentioned how easy it is to tie it to his son. We talk about many times the sacrifice. We thank God for the sacrifice that he gave, that his son gave for our salvation. And so it's just a natural tie-in to going through the challenge and the difficulty of watching the crucifixion, but then coming out of it saying, okay, all of these things were done for a reason, and I am now a contributing part of that. So it's bigger than me. And that helps too. It gets me out of my selfish mood when I realize that all of this is bigger than me. And so there's a lot to learn here, a lot of practical things. We want to continue to encourage all of you. If you have a thought or a comment about this, please reach out to us, commonsensegospel@yahoo.com. We'll take emails, questions, maybe a follow-up or something else you'd like to have addressed, commonsensegospel@yahoo.com. We would sure love to hear from you. I'm thinking too, Kurt, that at this point, people are saying, if they don't do trivia, I'm out of here. This is a last chance y'all are getting. So,
well, we know that there's probably been that clamor out there.
Yeah.
We want to be stretched here a little bit. We want to see you guys kind of make fools of each other. So.
That's right. I want to be tested and I want to watch you fail.
Yep. So, this episode, we're going to get back to our trivia questions.
And what did you say earlier? That this is an effort on our part to sacrifice our pride?
Yeah, well, our egos are going to get slammed here. If we don't answer these questions, then I've been humbled, which is a good thing.
Yeah,
I need that.
So we're sacrificing our ego, and for all of you out there, you're welcome. Trivia, sweet. All right, trivia question number 1 for Kurt and the rest of you who are eagerly listening. Question 1, which book in the Bible gives us the details of Paul's conversions?
That's the Book of Conversions, which is commonly called Acts.
Ah, yes. I know what you're doing. You're giving our listener time to think about that.
That's what it is. Yeah.
The book of Acts, written by Luke in Acts 9, Acts 22, and Acts chapter 26, in all 3 places, Paul either were given the time of his conversion, or he restates how that took place and what was said. So very good. It is the book of Acts.
All righty, and I've got my first one for you. Right now I'm reading through Proverbs, which are just inspired advice, practical application of wisdom. Here are things you need to do in your life. And some of them really stick in our memory because they have impact or maybe address something on our minds. But I'm going to recite the first half of a proverb, and I'd like you to finish it.
Okay.
So, righteousness exalts a nation, but it's not good to have dead air.
Well,
righteousness exalts a nation, but sin.
Oh, sin. Destroys. I don't know. I don't know the proverb.
Oh, yes, you do, Danny.
When you read it, I'll
you're
know
not
it.
able to. You're just not latching onto it. Righteousness exalts a nation. It's Proverbs 14:34, by the way, if that helps you out.
No.
Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people.
Sin is a reproach to any people. It's a great proverb, and it's utterly true.
And now you see the sacrifice that Danny made in our
That's right.
trivia here.
Just laid my ego on the line there. Yeah, it's like you said, Proverbs, some of them stick in your mind and they'll never go. And some are just phenomenal, but they don't seem to stick. So I think that's one of those that just didn't stick for me. It's
with all of those proverbs that are listed, it might be a little hard to focus on one and pull out the thought that's there.
Yeah, I appreciate you
giving
me room to make
I'm not going to withdraw you from any more gold stars just because of this.
Nice. All right, good. One more question for you from me. What disease in the Old Testament gets the most print as far as identifying the disease and the cleansing of it?
Leprosy.
Leviticus chapter 13, the entire chapter is dedicated to spotting and identifying leprosy, the process that the priest must go through with an individual who believes they might have leprosy. And then chapter 14 is the ritual, the religious steps. I don't know why I said it that way, but the prescribed steps in the law for the cleansing of leprosy, the things that a priest must do. And I'm just convinced that those 2 chapters are there to usher in Jesus, because I don't see anywhere else in the Bible where people with leprosy were coming in and going through those steps with a priest.
Yeah, it's interesting that God pays attention to that, because leprosy is unclean. It is a contagious, spreading disease, and leprosy is used as a type for sin. And so I believe it's a visual aid. Obviously, it's a disease that needs to be addressed, and God gives us the practical steps on how they were to deal with that. But sin is the same way. It's a devastating, contagious disease that is unclean, and it needs to be remedied by following certain procedures that God has ordained.
Exactly.
And so he uses that as a visual aid for us, as a lesson for us. All righty. Here's mine. I'm going to let you redeem yourself here.
Maybe.
Well, what it is we haven't done any trivia for over a month, so a little rusty here.
Yes.
But on what occasion did Jesus say, "Peace, be still"?
This is when he's in the boat with the disciples, and the water was raging, and the wind was blowing so hard that they thought they were going to die.
That's right. Mark chapter 4, verse 39. They were afraid because the water was spilling into the boat, and it was tempestuous. They woke the Lord up. Here he is sleeping, not worried about anything. And So he stands up and orders his creation to calm down, and it does instantly. God's creation obeys him as soon as he issues the command. All right, You got it.
Very good. We hope you all did well also. I'd like to know who might have gotten that proverb. I don't know why I need more confirmation that was a really hard question, but Kurt's been good to kind of pamper me after that shot I took in the ego. So in conclusion to the sacrifice concept, and again, we didn't want to leave out that Jesus is the center of it. So it's not that God said, I told you to sacrifice, now go get to it. It's Jesus reveals everything that means in the most perfect way. And I'd ask all of you to remember with me, the second to last statement that Jesus makes on the cross is, it is finished. His life fully and completely dedicated to obeying his Father. It is from that cross that he is ready to depart, and before he gives up his spirit, he takes a final glance over his preparations, his work, and his full compliance with God's will, and he is satisfied that nothing has been left undone. Knowing that all things were fulfilled and accomplished, he summons the servant death that was foretold, and he graciously departs from our presence. Before Jesus says it is finished, John tells us that Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scriptures might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. And John especially takes note of this moment when he watches his Savior on the cross, having lived a life of perfect obedience and sacrifice, and the spectacular way that the Son of God left this earth in full submission to the Father, holding fast to the promises of God and never compromising his truth. His entire life was a living sacrifice to his Father. The greatest sacrifice is to render complete obedience. As the Father gave him things to do and told him the things to say, he does only that which he was commanded. John emphasizes this truth more than any other gospel writer. Truly, truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself unless he sees the Father doing it. For whatever the Father does, the Son also does. Jesus would go on later to say, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. In another place, he says, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. Again, he says, for I came down from heaven, not to do my will, but the will of him who hath sent me. Many of his statements in the New Testament begin with the words, I must. Beginning at the tender age of 12, he says to his mother, I must be about my Father's business. From that point until his final breath, we watch him offer full obedience to the ever-present necessity which he cheerfully embraced and perfectly fulfilled without flaw or blemish. And so each one of us have a glorious opportunity today, right now, to render obedience to the Most High God and fully know that he is able to deliver us from sin and death. When we see Jesus, we have seen the Father, and we can fully know who we are following and who we have sacrificed for. It is offered by us for the glory of God.